Thank you all, and I'm going to transition us over to the next panel. We're going to go over the same amount of time because we have a break coming up before we transition over to Zoom room number 2. And our next panel is Oh So Emo. No subtitle, no post-colonic, Oh So Emo. And presenting for us today are Emma Garland on emo, the genre that can't grow up. I'm not sure if Alexus Erin is in the room yet, who is scheduled to present on Black Girl Emo Phase, Reconsidering a Third Wave Emo Bildungsroman at the Intersections of Race and Gender, and Look Up Kid, Queer Emo Youth and Differential Consciousness in Princess Nokia's A Girl Cried Red by Isaac Silber. So stick around and let's get emo together. I'm going to hand it over to Emma. Emma, I saw you come into the room, and I know that you're, where's Emma Garland? I did see Emma come into the room. I know that Emma's also, we have a couple of our presenters are beaming in from ostensibly the United Kingdom as well. So if Emma is not here, I'm going to hand it over to Alexus. Do you want to get us started, Alexus, and then we'll loop Emma back in once she reconnects?
Hi, yeah, sure, I'd love to. I just want to get my screen share together. Give me 1 second.
No problem at all. Thank you all for your patience with our technology here. I think it's going okay. And let us know if you need help, Alexus, with the screen share stuff.
Yeah, I actually might.
Okay. So are you having trouble just sharing the screen in the bottom? It should be on the bottom, like hover your cursor over onto the bottom strip.
Okay.
And you see the green share screen button. And then when you click on that, click in the left-hand corner on the little box that says share computer sound if you have computer sound to share. And then one more time, click share on the far right-hand corner. I know that there are a lot of buttons to push.
Okay.
There we go. You started sharing the screen.
Oh, great. Okay. So I will open up my presentation here. Okay, cool. Everyone can see everything now.
Yes, it looks fantastic.
Okay, great. So my name is Alexus Erin. I am usually based at the University of Manchester, but I am from New Jersey. And I've been quarantining at my parents' in Pennsylvania. So I'm in the right country for this. So I'm going to start out with this photo. I think I might have to cover up my bandmate there, Kevin. And this is the band that I was in my youth in 2009. I would say I was probably about 16 when this picture was taken. In my sort of pop punk first to second wave emo revivalist band, Your Innuendos Bore Me. I think sort of where the correct engendering of my my genre is. I think that we can probably have a debate about what the genre of that band really was, but I will say that when that photo was taken, we were performing Fall Out Boy, so I'll get into that. So I'm going to start with this introduction. Though widely ignored, the experience of Black American emo girlhood exists. It too is defined through traditional facets of pop punk angst, like suburban regionality, sort of let's get out of this town adolescent angst, and ideas surrounding difference or deviation from the norm. In many ways, the themes of emo music are similar to an essentialized experience of millennial Black American suburban girlhood, yet there is no and was no representation in the music or subculture I found itself. Speaking a little bit to this, I noticed that I grew up in New Jersey, as I previously mentioned, in central New Jersey, Mercer County, Princeton. In New Brunswick, there was a pretty significant sort of emo and screamo scene burgeoning. It was probably about 20 minutes from Princeton and still again within Mercer County. But with every single show that I had access to via YouTube, sort of the start of YouTube, when people were just putting their bands' performances on the internet, I noticed that absolutely none of those people involved seemed to be people of color. And I found that interesting. But as I grew up and I went to university, I could find other emo Black girls. When I went to shows, I'd always find maybe one other emo Black girl in the room. So I think that there's this sort of atomized identity of Black American emo adolescence that was sort of split up and divided throughout the United States. And the type of emo that I'll be focusing on, or the wave of emo, is third wave emo, the sort of mall punk, highly popularized MTV emo that we experienced between the mid-2000s to about 2010 to 2012. So my presentation will explore the theoretical implications of the Black feminine Bildungsroman by examining the sociological implications of identity, cultural capital, and the politics of affect and aesthetics in emo. So these are sort of the things that we'll be covering. I'll be touching a lot upon theory, and this is, there's a lot more that I'd like to touch upon, but for the interest of time, I'll probably just really lightly gloss upon sort of the nexus of these high theoretical ideas with identity. So I'll go into now a very brief history of emo, sort of born out of Washington, D.C. In the 80s hardcore scene, traditionally linked with the band Rites of Spring initially, and other sort of post-hardcore bands. There was a bit of controversy regarding this idea of emotional hardcore, with the lead singer of Fugazi sort of saying in 2003, and I found this quote to be, I'm going to relay this quote very specifically because I found it to be really interesting when we begin to think about things like the politics of affect, where he said, "I just thought all bands I played in were punk rock bands. The reason why I think that's so stupid is what, like the Bad Brains weren't emotional? Were they like robots or something? It just doesn't make any sense to me." And then it sort of, that wave of emo evolves into Revolution Summer, which is the summer of 1985, where the post-hardcore emo scene challenged the values of punk and other hardcore forebears. And that was a more political turn. And I think it's in the 90s that we start to see maybe a sonic representation of an effective term, and 90s emo, which is sort of it's noted as the second wave, was defined sort of by regionality, from the West Coast moving inland to the Midwest. And this is important because we see again during the emo revival, or a part of the emo revival, that emo sort of comes again to a heightened popularity in this sort of Midwest space. And it's also what it seems to be categorized as a lot of the time. When we think of emo, we think of maybe kids who wear black in suburban towns across America, oftentimes the Midwest, oftentimes where there's not a lot for people to do. You know, emo isn't necessarily linked with big city culture, I found in my research, as much as it is sort of the suburban and rural areas of America, where malls are, where strip malls are. And that's, again, the sort of later iterations of emo. In the 2000s, emo sort of takes a move into pop punk. And in the sort of first half of the 2000s, we see bands like Jimmy Eat World and Saves the Day. I actually went to school with David Soloway of Saves the Day in Princeton. They were much older than me, so I never really got a chance to spend any time with them. But then later on, and this is where I will be speaking more about my presentation, we move into mall punk and that sort of wave of emo, MTV emo, where we began to see bands like Fall Out Boy and My Chemical Romance, Paramore, move into the scene. And then after that, we sort of have the emo revivalists, the Midwest emo revivalists, and now, which is this, has been a really interesting nexus between SoundCloud rap, I found, and emo, which is really not only challenging the genre, but challenging the shape and the idea of emo itself. So I'll let you take a moment to read this quote from Gerard Way from My Chemical Romance. And I put this here so we can sort of remind ourselves of the context of mall emo. It's coming after 9/11, so youth culture who has experienced this sort of massive generational trauma. Okay, and I'll move on from there. So right now I'm working on a much larger project about being Black and a woman and coming of age in this moment of emo, but within a theoretical lens. So the first thing I look at Sarah Ahmed's cultural reproduction of emotion. And you can take a look at some of the quotes from that text I have here, but the point that I want to relay when I reference this text is that collective emotions sort of become an object of affect, and objects of affects are therein subject to being capitalized upon. So they're no longer feelings or collective emotions. The galvanizing of a nation after tragedy, general youth disaffectment, these things are subject to being moved as objects just by virtue of the fact that they are experienced in a collective way. So it's an idea of social presence as opposed to self-presence. And it's really interesting to me that emo tends to be really depoliticized, I think, generally in discourse. But I think that we forget that this idea of collective emotion, when examined within its historical context and its cultural context, become these really wieldy tools for change and these really wieldy tools for structural reproduction. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So I have here representation and denial of resolution and double consciousness, and that's where I intend, if I had a little bit longer, I'd be able to talk more about it here, but to dive more into my personal identity and the sort of lack of Blackness and lack of feminine representation, or any feminine representation with a lot of sovereignty. You know, that era of emo really saw only Hayley Williams of Paramore, I think, the lead singer of Flyleaf as well, even though I think that there is a little bit of debate as to whether or not she would sort of fall into that era of emo or if she would qualify as maybe a Christian metal band. But there weren't a lot of women who were able to have a voice of authority within the genre. So in this part of the presentation, and in this part of my larger piece, I will be sort of linking the idea of Du Bois's double consciousness, this idea that you identify yourself being watched through the eyes of the other, so it's sort of a split consciousness, with John Berger's male gaze, of course. And I have here a Margaret Atwood quote that also sort of sums up this idea of voyeurism that is internalized and then comes out of the self. You are seeing yourself through the other's eyes. And then this sort of like binary dichotomy between men and women in emo, because we know, of course, in mall emo, I think specifically, unfortunately, there is a lot of music and rhetoric that is violent towards women, that has a sort of rebuffed romantic turn and very negative in the way that it speaks about women. And also, emo tends to have a lot of female fans as well. I think that there can be a lot of similarities drawn between how young women reacted to this wave of emo as how young women have reacted throughout the decades to boy bands. So this idea of you being seen through someone else's eyes, and that's the self that you can identify, but you're always aware of that being watchedness. Then I have here emo and the replication of structural cultural capital, and that's sort of the mobilization of this idea that Sarah Ahmed had with the politics of affect and cultural affect and emotion. And it's the idea, again, that these objects of affect then become part of structural cultural capital. And so I'm referencing Bourdieu here predominantly I'm referencing Bourdieu here. But I think that the whole point of this idea is that these emotions, which become these objects of affects, which are then subject to capital and the structural implications of capital, the way that emo can sort of be, how emo was so popular in the mainstream. I think this wave of emo, mall emo, reached a type of popularity that its previous generations through the 80s and 90s did not. And I think that, again, even after the emo revival didn't have the same level of cultural push as this sort of mall and MTV emo did. And I think it was only really when mall emo began to happen that emo was no longer just a genre, but a subculture, and that subculture could be capitalized on at Hot Topic. Cliques were made, cliques in school were made not just from the love of music, but from the images, the cultural images and artifacts of that, what was seen as a genre previously. So this idea of replication and structural cultural capital is coming from the idea that what these objects of affect do they reproduce themselves in a very Bourdieusian way. And they create sort of the structural, they create and reflect the structural conditions in which we live. So to say all of that, emo didn't have a lot of Blackness. It didn't have a lot of women and sovereignty, and that actually reflects the world that we live in. The disparity for music, for women in music to have sovereignty, to be able to talk about themselves outside of the context of men. Black women in music having power outside of genres that are, relayed in culture for Black women, such as rap and hip hop. In a way, emo managed to not only take the reflections of culture at large and incorporate them into the subcultural genre, but also reproduce those ideas. So in this presentation, in this part of the presentation, I talk about how, and I think the most important part is who has this cultural code that Bourdieu talks about, and for that only those who have the cultural competence to tap into the ideas which makes emo salient and popular, and whether those ideas are, mass cultural grief, coming of age in a time when things are different after a major tragedy. And then also the liminality and the grief of growing up, the pains of being young. Having the key, the code to tap into that is cultural competence for that part of the culture. So the idea is who has the code and to whom this aesthetically effective turn is encoded for, and that's for the young. And then the question, of course, that I'm posing is who's young, and which groups, demographics of young people are represented in these ideas. So if I had a little bit more time, I would talk a bit more about the liminality of coming of age of the Bildungsroman, the ideas of border crossing and transgression when we sort of look at Blackness and emo-ness at a nexus, I think in the same way that you didn't see Black people represented very well in third wave emo, I'll be able to tell you as a Black emo at that time, that the Black community also said that this music isn't for you. So you're sort of getting it from both sides. And what does it mean to transgress those lines and to move in a place where no one can see you? Adolescent power struggle and alienation and deviation from the norm. I think that a lot of those things are maybe quintessential to the Black feminine Bildungsroman, growing up and being a Black girl in America. Those ideas, I think, are both represented in emo and in that kind of coming of age. Grief and arrested development, Blackness, girlhood, and America's moral panic. And we had a little bit more time. I would also talk about the politics of feminine emo aesthetics and who it is they seem to fit. So that is all from me. Oop. I'll leave you with this. If the cultural structure of emo relays the societal structures of racism and patriarchy, how do Black emo girls get free? And I'm still trying to work that out myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexus. And we're going to go right directly to Isaac's paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Virtual hand claps. And you can hit stop share at the top of the screen. That little red button.
I see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. So, Isaac.
Hey, thanks. Thanks so much, Alexus. That was amazing. And I'm like really grateful to you for kind of laying out that history of emo, and also like the overwhelming whiteness and masculinity of emo, and like what it means for Black women to kind of navigate through that space. Because I'm going to be talking about Princess Nokia, and I think she does that in a really interesting kind of way. So I'm excited to see how our papers kind of go together. Also, real quick, big shout out to Karen Thompson and also Robert Rutherford. Thank you so much for making all this happen in like the probably worst time for this to be happening. So thank you for that, everyone at Mopop. Also going to try to share my screen. Yes. Share computer sound. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about Princess Nokia's emo EP called A Girl Cried Red. And I was first really drawn to Princess Nokia. Her name is Destiny Frascari. To her work as a fan in like 2016 and 2017, songs like Tomboy and Brujas and Green Line started surfacing for her album 1992. But one of the things that has really always struck me about her work is the way that she is like seemingly able to kind of fluidly move between genres and styles in a way that both kind of refuses the sort of carceral limitation of like fixed categorization that we all know that the industry kind of does, but while also simultaneously refusing the demands that the pop industry often places upon women, and particularly women of color, to kind of like constantly reinvent yourself throughout your career in order to have like relevance or things like that. I think she's kind of moved through her career from her first to like viral internet hit, which is Versace Hottie, which is kind of like a house track, like a club track, to like their first experimental rap album, which is Metallic Butterfly down here. And then from that, she has this kind of lesser known kind of 70s like funk EP called Honeysuckle. And then from that, she moved to 1992, which is more kind of classic hip hop record. And from that, she has now this kind of emo EP that came out in 2018, A Girl Cried Red, and followed by like her most recent records, Everything is Beautiful and Everything Sucks, which is like a double album that she recently came out with this year. And this kind of mobility may appear at first to be a series of like reinventions, but I think when you look closer within each project, you can see that all the pieces have always kind of been there. It's just the overall framing of each individual album concept that changes to highlight unique aspects of like the multiple identities that she's always, as a Gemini, trying to express all at once, perhaps kind of culminating in this most recent double EP, Everything's Beautiful, Everything Sucks. So one metaphor that I found really helpful for thinking about this interwoven trajectory of Princess Nokia's career comes in the work of third world feminist Jayla Sandoval, whose notion of differential consciousness provides one of the frameworks I want to use to think about the kind of ongoing critique of identity that Destiny makes by way of this kind of itinerant movement through multiple sounds and genres and aesthetics. For Sandoval, differential consciousness, which she introduced in her 1991 essay, U.S. Third World Feminism, the Theory and Method of Oppositional Consciousness in the Postmodern World, and further develops in her book, Methodology of the Oppressed, is a practice and method of opposition to white supremacist patriarchal power that she recognizes to have emerged out of the third world feminist thought and practice from the 60s to 90s. Sandoval uses the metaphor of the clutch of a six-shift car, the mechanism, she says, that permits the driver to select, engage, and disengage gears in a system for the transmission of power, to think about how differential consciousness operates as a practice of moving between modes of oppositional consciousness, from what she terms the feminist equal rights mode, to the revolutionary mode, to the supremacism mode, to the separatism mode, all modes of opposition to heteronormative white supremacist patriarchy, which can serve various purposes at various times for revolution or simply for survival or for neither or both. The fluid position of differential consciousness, a position that defies the very idea of occupying a particular position, is one that recognizes the importance of incorporating tactics and strategies of resistance into the ways in which particularly women of color must navigate the dynamics of power within white supremacist racial capitalism. I think this is an important theoretical frame to think about how Princess Nokia has navigated her way, not simply through life as a young Afro-Latina and indigenous woman in New York City, not only through her creative work as an artist in both underground and popular now spheres, mixing genres and styles and aesthetics, but also in her career as an independent artist in the music industry, refusing to sign to a major label and instead maneuvering in and out of various distribution deals with platforms like Platoon and also with labels like Rough Trade Records now this year, kind of establishing her own distribution label, Princess Nokia Incorporated, which is something that I'm really interested in. And I haven't learned too much. I don't think there's much available to think about Princess Nokia Incorporated yet, but I'm interested in how that's happened. But thinking Princess Nokia alongside Sandoval's clutch metaphor, I think also helps in a way to flesh out this mechanism of the clutch, this fluid non-position. If we ask who is the one operating the clutch of Sandoval's vehicle, much in the way that Butler questions who or what it is that comes before Althusser's interpolated subject in the psychic life of power, I will not pretend to have an answer to this complex existential critique of the subject, but I do want to point towards emo and Princess Nokia's particular aesthetic mobility within and with it as a potential window into this non-position. With that, I want to play Your Eyes Are Bleeding by Princess Nokia. Hopefully you all can hear it. So this emphasis on youth, on childhood, on being a child or being childish, in connection to feeling emo in this record was the first piece that made me want to discuss it in this conference. From this line in Your Eyes Are Bleeding, where she separates the child she claims she is from the grown-up she thought she was, to Look Up Kid, which speaks directly to a child, real or imagined, saying, look up kid, I can see on your face you're going through something, to Morphine, where she whines, I'm an emo little boy and I want someone to hold me, bending gender just as easily as she bends genre. And with the concluding track, Little Angel, written to a young queer child who has been tragically taken from the we she invokes, the position of the child from all kinds of vantages shows up throughout this record. So I also, along with Alexus, want to ask, what is this connection between youth and emo? Is there something about the kind of existential sadness, depression, and vulnerability of emo that we associate with being young? Or is the connection specific to this particular moment in musical time? Where when artists and fans in our mid to late 20s are stuck reminiscing on the underground and mainstream emo that took our radios by storm while we were in middle and high school, effectively transforming so many of our young adult lives. I think for Destiny, the relationship between childhood and emo is in some ways very direct. She talks in multiple interviews about dealing with anger and depression as a child and young adult, dealing with an abusive mother in foster care and not knowing where or how to redirect her anger and pain. And emo music accompanied her through this period and is something that she always has carried with her since. But for Destiny, it isn't just childhood emotions that inform the scope of her emo. And I want to focus for a minute on the penultimate track of the record, At the Top, which I think complicates in many ways the place that emo holds for Destiny, but also informed how you might think about this new moment in the history of emo, its relationship to youth and to queer minoritarian subjectivities, and its recent kind of fusion with trap and hip hop that Alexus was talking about a bit too. So this is At the Top. I'm just going to play the chorus of it to save a little time.
It get lonely at the top, everyone's sick. It get lonely at the top, and I do it by myself. I got everything I want without anybody help. Do you think I give a fuck? Only care about myself. I'm a stone cold killer, couple notches on my belt. It get lonely at the top, and I do it by myself. I got everything I want without anybody help. Do you think I give a fuck? Only care about myself. I'm a stone cold killer, couple notches on my belt. I don't front for the gram, this is just who I am. I don't ride on no wave, I don't tag on no plan. I don't fuck for no clout, I don't beg for no man. I don't care about fame, I just care about bands. I came out of the...
I get lonely at the top and I do it by myself. I got everything I want without anybody help. Do you think I give a fuck? Only care about myself. I'm a stone cold killer, couple notches on my belt. We've heard this track before. It's reminiscent of so many tracks on a lot of hip hop records that have come before it. The track that kind of boasts of financial success achieved alone in spite of competition, exploitation, racism, sexism, and all the oppressive symptoms of neoliberal racial capitalism. Placed here, I think this track does a lot of work. I think with At the Top, Destiny not only claims this emo EP's spot as a hip hop record, but she also reminds us that every time we hear this kind of track, the track that boasts of the struggle to succeed as an artist of color in isolation amidst an industry that constantly attempts to exploit one's creative expression for profit, or forces one to navigate objectification and sexualization, especially as a woman of color. This is a story of emo too. Placing this track here in the penultimate spot is a powerful reminder that the message, don't push me because I'm close to the edge, I'm trying not to lose my head, is emo as hell. And rap has always had these kind of existential feelings embedded in it, as it has become more and more evident with this new wave of emo trap or pop punk or emo SoundCloud rap, however you want to label it. That emo, beyond specificities of a sound or a visual aesthetic, responds to a set of feelings produced by the conditions of racial capitalism. From white upper middle class boys feeling nothing but alienation, sadness, and depression, to minoritarian subjects feeling brown and feeling down, in the words of Jose Munoz. Oppression and isolation, racism, homophobia, misogyny, sexism, ableism, ageism, classism, and structures of power that necessitate the exploitation of racialized and marginalized bodies as part of its normal mode of operation produces a kind of sadness and depression on all sides of the spectrum that emo gives a voice to and an avenue for the expression of, I think. In this light, for Princess Nokia, emo holds a really complicated position. On one level, this record shows us how intimately tied emo is with their queerness, how questions of gender, unrequited queer love, feelings of isolation and sadness and vulnerability, and a desire for queer youth to have a brighter vision for the future are all connected. And for her, her blend of emo and queerness is also in many ways the condition of her Sandoval and Clutch, the piece of her identity that both necessitates but also enables her to move between identities, spaces, and genres from a more fluid non-position. Emo is also a condition of her artistic success. Her connection to emo has helped her reach a fan base that loves the multiple sides of her, and that especially appreciates and affirms the strength of her unique Afro-Latinidad feminism, which he calls urban feminism, which embraces this love of emo music and aesthetics. And yet, at the same time, as a simultaneous condition of this success, emo is also a set of complex feelings produced by the struggle for financial success within a context of racial capitalist exploitation, alienation, isolation, competition, degradation, objectification. Emo is intimately tied to youth, but it also never really goes away. Look up, kid, it gets better, but you won't even know it. Look up, kid, it gets lonely at the top, and I do it by myself. Maybe her most recent double album, Everything is Beautiful, Everything Sucks, kind of says it perfectly. And I wanted to play Morphine at the end just to listen to that, but I think my time might be up, I'm not really sure. But anyone can listen to that. It's on Spotify if you want to.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Cheers, cheers. We seem to be be having difficulty reconnecting with Emma. So we really did have her in the room in the beginning, and I don't know what's happened, and she's not in the other room. So we're going to go ahead and proceed with Q&A and the questions that have come in. There have been plenty that have come into the chat, and those mostly came in after Alexus. So if you have a question for Isaac, please let us know. I guess that we'll begin with, we're going to begin with a question actually from Paula Probst, who asks about the current geography or physical or virtual location of current emo culture revivalists. And I think that this is an answer that that both of you could provide. So I'm going to throw that out there. Also, we can unmute all of the participants if you want to ask questions more broadly. But let me throw that question out first to our panelists. The current geography, physical or virtual, of emo culture revivalists.
I think that is a tough one, particularly now in the sort of post-Midwest revival era of emo. And I think especially, and maybe Isaac will be able to speak to this a little bit, in emo's sort of new face in sort of SoundCloud rap and mainstream rap immediately thereafter, which is, I'm thinking maybe the SoundCloud era of emo rap hybrids happened maybe between 2013, so moving forward into more mainstream adaptations. I'm thinking even now of Doja Cat sampling Blink-182 for Bottom Bitch.
Yeah.
So where those things are happening to me, I think that, again, maybe the internet has sort of atomized that idea, whereas before you could see the migration of emo moving West Coast inland and being in the mid-Atlantic area, New Jersey, New York, sort of where those bands were popping up and where their fans were popping up. But now I'm not so terribly sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I think you see like other rural parts of the country, like Scranton, Pennsylvania, I think is like the headquarters of Goth Boy Click, which is one kind of like emo SoundCloud rap, emo trap, pop punk, I guess, kind of group. And then there's like, I think also still the Midwest, I think there's still like around Minnesota. And I think in a lot of ways, like a lot of the SoundCloud rap has come out of kind of rural parts. Yeah, but then, I mean, you have like, I guess, kind of the really big rise of Lil Peep, I think, was one like big thing for emo, and Juice WRLD also like another really big emo rapper. So I think the revival has really, for the most part, been in rap and in SoundCloud rap. So I agree with that.
And I'm going to remind everyone, we're going to extend this panel by about 5 minutes. So because we have a break right after. We have a 15-minute break coming up before the next set of sessions begins in Zoom Room 2 at 11 a.m. So we have some extra time here to answer some questions. I'm going to also ask, a question that just came in from Janessa Williams, to think for a moment about the criticisms raised regarding emo's representation of women. And there are several other questions in the chat that are specifically linked to gender, so it can be an extension of those questions. Do we think that this is improving with the new generation of artists of Princess Nokia's era? So for example, I know that like, I guess Glenn McDonald and JD and Carl also were having a conversation a little bit about how gender and genre work through emo. And this, as an addendum to that, if you could both elaborate a little bit. I'll start with you, Isaac, on this one. Do we think that any of the kind of the gender trouble in emo is improving in this later generation of artists like Princess Nokia?
I'm not sure if it's improving. I do know that I think that there's been a really strong response to the fact that like in her shows, Princess Nokia is very much like, I want Black women to come to the front and I want women at the front. And people have really responded positively to that. And I think that her, also, I think she talks about how she got like the idea to create that kind of space in her concerts from thinking about like Bikini Kill and Riot Girl. And I think in a lot of ways, like that feminist punk history like has also influenced the way that more women of color are kind of in emo and in punk currently. So I mean, in some ways it might be improving, I think, but in a lot of ways I know that it's still like, I think a lot of people have said that her emo record didn't sound like authentic and like things like that, you know, those kinds of very racialized and gendered comments that that fans of emo have made about her work. So
yeah, I think that I would say that there have been some maybe short steps into seeing better representation of women in the genre and better representation of women's stories, narratives, and experiences. I'm thinking right now, of course, we have Princess Nokia, as Isaac mentioned. I'm thinking right now of Mint Green, which is sort of a Boston-based DIY band who have very publicly said that one of their greatest influences was Paramore. And I'm also thinking of very recently, I think Rico Nasty sort of came out and said, I am a pop punk princess, and sort of reclaiming both that aesthetic and those sonic ideas, which I think it's a really great first step. I'm not quite sure at this point where emo is going, if it will continue this sort of like mainstream rap arc it's sort of latched itself onto somehow, or if we will have another kind of rock-based revival of emo. I think that American Football's last album was fairly recent, so I think that's always possible that those things and those sounds can happen again. I think that people being inspired by enjoying things like Emo Night and coming together to reflect upon that part of youth culture for them might, be where we start to see this kind of change.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask this one last question that Jorge Leal brought up to just finish up the panel about 9/11 historical trauma, how it's reflected in emo through the 2000s and the 20-teens into now. And invite both of you, even though that was a part of Alexus's presentation, I want to invite both of you to talk about it because it's relevant to the kind of emo periodization you're both talking about. In fact, Isaac, I'm going to start with you and see if there's anything that you want to say about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Alexus was talking about the kind of collective trauma that gets put into emo. I guess thinking about both 9/11 and also kind of the aftermath, like the war on terror kind of moment of global trauma that we're kind of still in today. I think maybe even both, like I think, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I really see that how the effect that's had on emo, but also maybe kind of like the condition of the contemporary war on terror and the place that's come to now. I could really see also how that's effect is kind of embedded in like the contemporary revival of emo. And kind of thinking about, I think in one of the panels last week, I think it was the Joe Rap panel where there was discussion of like nihilist aesthetics versus aesthetic nihilism. And I think like that kind of feels like a condition of the contemporary war on terror moment that we find ourselves in. And I can really see how that's also resonated so much with a contemporary kind of emo revival and those like existential feelings of kind of sadness and depression that global racial capitalism is really kind of, put here on this globe.
Alexus.
Yeah, I would certainly say that I feel like maybe, and for those of you who are still sort of mall punk and third wave emo at heart, the idea that Gerard Way started My Chemical Romance sort of as he watched the towers fall. I believe that he had like an internship at Cartoon Network or something, and he was in the city and he happened to be there that day, and as he was sort of standing out with his coworkers and people sort of watching it happen, he had this idea that life is short and that he's going to do what it was he wanted to do. And that's sort of how My Chemical Romance was born. But even taking a look at some of My Chemical Romance's aesthetics, these very macabre aesthetics that I think developed over time. That's not what we really saw in Pensy Prep, which was his first band, and the first 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, My Chemical Romance's first album. We may not have seen those so clearly, but I think sort of in the wake of 9/11 and living in the war on terror sort of as a larger period, as a larger idea, that's sort of when those macabre aesthetics began to pick up. And I think that that's a really big part of that era of emo. And I think that influenced a lot of other bands in its popularity and in the subcultural popularity.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We're sorry we lost Emma. And there's so many rich questions and comments in the chat window. So thank you so much for being participants in this. We have Zoom Room 2 being activated at 11. Jason King will be hosting over there. Thank you all very much. And yeah, we'll see you in Zoom Room 2 where the program begins in a little under 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.